Dad, if there's any truth left in your love for me, show up at my graduation tomorrow. Henry Anderson had buried his daughter 2 years ago, but a message sent from her number tore through his family's false peace. Clara was dead in the documents, in the funeral photos, and in the public memory of the Andersons, but someone knew details no imposter could possibly know. As Henry's wife tried to delete the message before he could think too much, the past began to bleed through small cracks. A graduation in New York City might reveal that the family's greatest tragedy was never Clara's death, but rather the lie they put in its place. To uncover the truth, Henry would have to face not only enemies within his home but also his own guilt. The grand ballroom of the Anderson estate, in Boston, was filled with expensive flutes, white flowers, and voices too hushed to sound sincere. It was the 2nd anniversary of Clara's death, and Beatrice had transformed the memory of her stepdaughter into an elegant, controlled ceremony. Impeccable, as if even grief needed to obey the family's strict protocol, overlooking the grand piano. A photo of Clara, at 19, stood on the piano, smiling with bright eyes, wearing the delicate necklace she inherited from her mother. Henry remained before that image for too long, an untouched glass in hand and an old pain trapped in his chest. Then his phone vibrated once, twice. He looked by reflex, expecting nothing but messages from executives, lawyers, or acquaintances offering belated condolences, but the name on the screen drained the color from his face. Clara, the message read, "Dad, you promised you wouldn't miss my graduation. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. Don't be late again by just a few seconds." Henry stopped breathing. The room remained full of murmurs, footsteps, cutlery touching porcelain, but everything seemed to sink into a thick silence. Impossible. Beatrice was the first to notice the change in his face, crossing the ballroom with a tense smile. "Henry, what happened?" He didn't answer. Mark, Beatrice's son and CFO of Sterling Group, approached close behind, adjusting his suit cuff like someone preparing for a corporate, not a family, crisis. Henry turned the screen toward them. Beatrice read the message, her expression hardening before she could feign shock. "This is cruel," she said softly. "Someone is using Clara's name to hurt you." Mark tilted his head and added, "Or to extort money. Dad, give me that phone. I'll call the digital security team now." Henry gripped the device tightly, as if someone had tried to snatch away the last living piece of his daughter. "Nobody touches this," he replied, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. Beatrice took a deep breath, controlling her tone, aware of the observing guests. "My love, please. Clara died. We buried your daughter. You signed the papers yourself." The sentence hit Henry like a blow. He looked at the portrait above the piano, then at the message, then at his wife. "I signed because you told me it was her body." Beatrice paled for a minimal fraction of a second, too fast for others to notice, but not for Henry. Mark interjected, sharply, "This makes no sense. The accident was confirmed. The hospital confirmed it. The family lawyer confirmed it." Henry read the message one more time, fixated on a small word, graduation. Clara had argued with him before she died because she wanted to study law in New York, far from the company, far from the Anderson name. He had called it rebellion. She had called it freedom in their last argument. Clara had slammed the door and said, "One day you'll be too late, Dad." Now that phrase returned disguised as an invitation. An older woman, Henry's aunt, approached, asking if he felt ill, but Beatrice gently waved her away. She then firmly gripped her husband's arm. "Let's go to the study." Now, Henry allowed himself to be led, but didn't release his phone in the hallway, away from the guests. Beatrice lost some of her softness. "You can't let yourself be destroyed by a message. Not again." Henry stopped midway. "Again?" She closed her eyes as if she had said too much, then corrected herself. "I mean, you almost died of guilt once. I won't watch that happen again." He stared at her. There was love on her face, or something that resembled love when the light was favorable, but there was also fear, not fear for him, but fear of something he might discover. "The message came from Clara's old number," he said. "Henry, that number was cancelled," Beatrice retorted. "Then someone reactivated it." He brought the phone closer to her face. "And someone knew I promised to go to her graduation. Nobody knew that." Beatrice averted her gaze. Mark, who had followed him to the study door, frowned. "Clara talked a lot, Henry. She could have told friends." Henry laughed without humor. "She didn't call it graduation. She called it an educated escape. She said I'd only step foot in a public university if I were buying the building." The memory cut him deeply because, at the time, he had laughed with scorn. Clara hadn't laughed. Clara had cried. Beatrice touched his shoulder, now in a lower voice. "You're looking for signs because you feel guilty, and I understand. But guilt doesn't bring anyone back to life." Henry looked at her hand on his shoulder. For the first time in years, he felt an urge to push it away, nor does it bury questions. Mark opened his mouth to retort, but the phone vibrated again. An image appeared. It was a poor, shaky photograph, taken from a distance, showing a young woman in a black graduation gown, her back to the camera, standing before a university mural. On her left wrist glowed a silver bracelet with a small moon charm. Henry felt his legs weaken. That bracelet had been his gift to Clara for her 15th birthday, a rare attempt to compensate for his absences with tenderness. After the accident, Beatrice had told him the bracelet was lost in the car fire. The police had never returned it. The hospital had never mentioned it. Yet there it was, fastened to the wrist of a woman who, even from behind, carried the same way of hunching her shoulders when she wanted to appear stronger than she was. "That's a fake," Mark said, but his voice faltered. Beatrice snatched the phone from Henry's hand with a sudden movement. He reacted quickly, grabbing her wrist. The glass still in his other hand fell to the carpet, spilling wine like dark blood. "Give it back," he ordered. Beatrice froze. "You're hurting my arm." Henry let go, startled by his own force, but retrieved the device. "I'm sorry, but don't try to erase my daughter from my hand." The study door closed. Outside, the ceremony continued with soft music, as if the mansion wasn't cracking from within. Inside, Henry paced back and forth, trying to call Clara's number. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail on the third try. There was no voice, just silence. Beatrice sat on the leather sofa, crossing her legs, recomposing the image of a sensible woman. "Henry, listen to yourself. If Clara were alive, she would have come back. She would have looked for you sooner." The sentence hurt because it was exactly what he feared. Perhaps his daughter was alive and had chosen not to return. Perhaps her death would have been less cruel than the abandonment he deserved. "And what if she couldn't?" Mark asked. "Dad, you're building an absurdity on top of two messages." Henry turned to him. "And you're trying to destroy that absurdity too quickly." The silence that followed was heavy. Beatrice rose, walked to the table, and picked up the smaller photo frame near the books. In the picture, Clara appeared beside Henry in Martha's Vineyard, still a teenager, with wet hair and a rare smile. Beatrice looked at the image with such well-crafted sorrow that it almost convinced. "I lost Clara too," she said. Henry stared at her. "No, you lost a stepdaughter who never liked you. I lost a daughter I didn't know how to listen to." Beatrice gripped the photo frame tightly. "That's unfair," he replied without raising his voice. "Perhaps, but today, I don't have the strength to be fair to anyone." Mark ran a hand through his hair, irritated. "What do you intend to do? Take a private jet to New York because of a blurry photo?" Henry looked at the screen, where the word tomorrow seemed to pulse. "Yes." Beatrice became still. For an instant, all her elegance vanished, and Henry saw something raw, almost aggressive, cross her eyes. "You won't." The phrase came out short, wrong, too authoritative. Mark noticed and looked at his mother. Henry did too. "Excuse me?" Beatrice quickly corrected her tone. "You shouldn't go. It's different. Your emotional health, the press, the shareholders, all of this could turn into a scandal." Henry approached her slowly. "Since when do you care more about shareholders than the possibility of Clara being alive?" Beatrice replied. "Since I watched you try to destroy yourself after the burial." Henry closed his eyes. The burial that day without an open casket, without a farewell, without a final touch, just a sealed coffin, technical explanations, medical recommendations, hurried lawyers, and Beatrice holding his hand while saying that seeing the body would only increase the trauma. He had accepted, signed, fallen apart. That night, after the guests left, and the mansion became a luxurious prison once more, Henry entered Clara's old room alone. Beatrice detested that room, but had never dared to dismantle it completely. There were stacks of law books, a denim jacket hanging behind the door, photos of friends taped to a bulletin board, and a wooden box filled with old tickets, letters, and trinkets his daughter kept as proof that she had lived outside her father's shadow. Henry opened the box with trembling hands. He found an old note from Clara, written at 16, complaining about a cancelled trip. At the end, there was a phrase, "Don't be late again." The same way she omitted the apostrophe in "don't" from stubbornness or haste. The phone message had the same error. Henry sat on the bed and, for the first time in 2 years, didn't cry for Clara as dead. He cried for not knowing where she was. Near midnight, Robert Davies arrived through the side entrance of the estate. He was a lawyer, too young to carry such gravity in his gaze, but he knew old secrets of the Anderson family because he had worked with Helen, Henry's first wife, and Clara's mother. Henry received him in the study without turning on all the lights, showing him the messages, the photograph, and the bracelet. Robert didn't react with theatrical astonishment. He simply grew serious in a way that frightened Henry even more. "I need to ask you one thing before any action," he said. "Did you see Clara's body?" Henry paused before replying, "No." Robert rested his fingers on the table. "Who identified her?" Henry felt ashamed of his own answer before saying, "The hospital, the family lawyer. Beatrice handled everything because I was sedated." Robert breathed slowly. "So we don't have a death." "We have documents saying there was a death." The phrase changed the atmosphere in the study. Henry stood up, as if he needed height to endure it. "You think Clara is alive?" Robert didn't answer immediately. He picked up his phone, zoomed in on the image, and pointed to the bottom left corner, where part of a blue plaque was visible. State University of New York, Law Department. "Tomorrow, there's a law graduation ceremony in one of their auditoriums. I can legally confirm the list of graduates first thing in the morning." Henry clenched his hand on the edge of the table. "Go," Robert assented, "but not as a desperate father. Go as someone who knows that if this is true, whoever hid Clara had 2 years to erase traces." Henry looked at the door, remembering Beatrice on the other side of the house. "And what if the person is inside here?" Robert held his gaze. "Then pretend you haven't noticed yet." The next morning, Beatrice found Henry's bed untouched and his closet open. She hurried downstairs, not fully made up, a rarity startling enough to alarm a longtime housekeeper. Mark was in the hall, reading a message on his phone. "He went, didn't he?" she asked. Mark didn't answer. Beatrice snatched the device from his hand and saw only a flight confirmation to New York, issued before dawn. For a moment, her mask completely slipped. "Damn it, Henry," she whispered. Mark watched his mother as if seeing her for the first time. "Why are you so afraid?" Beatrice raised her eyes, and the answer came too harshly. "Because dead people should stay dead when an entire family depends on it." As soon as she realized what she had said, she tried to regain control, but Mark had already taken a step back. The silence between them was more accusing than any question. On the private jet, Henry didn't touch the coffee served, nor the reports left by his secretary. Robert sat in front of him with a thin folder and a tablet, but he also spoke little. Below, the clouds obscured the path to New York City, as if the very sky conspired to delay the truth. Henry opened his phone's gallery, alternating between the old photo of Clara and the blurry image of the graduate from behind. No single piece of evidence was sufficient, yet all of them were impossible to ignore. "If it's a fraud, I'll survive," he said without looking at Robert. "But if it's her," his voice faltered. Robert finished carefully, "If it's her, you'll need to listen before you ask for forgiveness." Henry swallowed hard. For the first time, he understood that finding Clara alive might not be receiving a miracle. Perhaps it would be attending the most intimate trial of his own life. When the car left the airport and entered the bustling streets of New York, Henry felt a strange vertigo. It wasn't just the city, it was the idea that Clara might have breathed that air for 2 years while he prayed before a tombstone. The university auditorium was nestled among old trees and bright buildings, lacking the aggressive luxury of places where the Andersons usually triumphed. There were families with flowers, fathers taking photos, mothers crying prematurely, young people laughing loudly with graduation gowns in their arms. Henry stopped at the entrance, almost unable to proceed. Robert touched his shoulder. "There's still time to turn back." Henry looked at the parents embracing their living children and replied, "I was already too late once." Then he stepped inside, approaching the graduate display board. Among dozens of names, he found a small photograph of a young woman named Olivia Reed. Her face was thinner, and there was a discreet scar near her eyebrow, but her eyes were Clara's. For the first time in 2 years, Henry Anderson was certain his daughter was not in the grave. Henry stood still before the display board, as if the university floor had vanished beneath his expensive shoes. Olivia Reed's photograph was small, printed alongside dozens of smiling faces, but for him, there were only those eyes, the same eyes Clara raised when she wanted to challenge him, the same ones that welled up when he promised to arrive but didn't. Robert approached slowly, not touching him this time. "Henry, breathe. A resemblance isn't enough." But Henry was already leaning toward the plaque, reading the full name, the course, the class, the graduation time. "Olivia Reed," he repeated, as if the name hurt his mouth. "Who gave her that name?" Robert replied in a low voice. or who needed to take the other away. Around them, families passed with bouquets, gift bags, and phones held aloft to capture a happy day. Henry felt envious of that normalcy. For 2 years, he had brought flowers to a grave. Now there were parents complaining about parking while embracing living children. It humiliated him inside. Robert led Henry to a side area, away from the flow of guests. He had confirmed by phone that Olivia Reed was indeed on the official list of law graduates, but the university could not provide personal data beyond what was public. Even so, one detail bothered him. She transferred in 2 semesters after Clara's accident, Robert said, looking at the tablet. Before that, there's almost nothing. A simple address in a Brooklyn neighborhood. No old school records attached in the open system, no relatives listed in the class dedications. Henry pressed his fingers against his wedding ring, an old gesture of anxiety. Clara wanted to study law. She wanted to prove she could exist without my last name. Robert observed the auditorium, where technicians were testing microphones. If it's her, someone helped. A young woman coming out of a serious accident, without a name, without money. She doesn't reconstruct documents and a life alone. Henry turned to him. Do you think Helen left something? The name of his first wife passed between them like a shadow. Robert replied cautiously. Helen didn't trust the Anderson family much, perhaps more than you imagined. While Henry tried to gather courage to enter the auditorium, back in Boston, Beatrice slammed her closet door so hard that one of the maids paused in the hallway. The mansion, too clean after the previous night's ceremony, seemed to accuse her in silence. She took an old cell phone from a secret drawer, a device Mark had never seen and Henry would never know existed. She called Dr. Alan Smith, administrative director of Street Constance Hospital, where Clara had been taken after the accident. He went to New York, Beatrice said, without preamble. On the other end, there was a long pause. Beatrice, after 2 years, you can't just call me like this. She laughed joylessly. Don't talk to me about time. Time is what I bought for all of us. Alan lowered his voice. The files are closed. Beatrice looked in the mirror and saw a woman without makeup, without patience, without room for error. Closed doesn't mean dead. I want to know who accessed any record linked to that night. The doctor breathed heavily. That leaves traces? Beatrice replied. Then erase them better. Mark only heard the end of the conversation. Standing outside the room, invisible through the narrow gap in the door, he hadn't understood all the words, but he had understood the tone. His mother wasn't speaking like a woman protecting an injured husband. She was speaking like someone protecting an old crime. When Beatrice emerged, he pretended to look for a folder on the sideboard. Are you all right? He asked. She recomposed her face with startling speed. Your stepfather is being manipulated. I need to prevent him from destroying our family. Mark held her gaze. Our family, or your version of it? The question offended her. Be careful what you imply. He wanted to back down, as he always did when Beatrice reminded him of everything she had done to get him into Sterling Group. But a phrase was stuck in his head. Dead people should stay dead when an entire family depends on it. Mom, Clara could be alive. Beatrice approached him with a dangerous calm. Clara died because she needed to die for Henry to survive. Mark felt a chill. That's not an answer. She touched his face, maternal and threatening at the same time. It's the only one you'll get today. Meanwhile, Olivia Reed stood in the women's restroom reserved for graduates, gripping the edge of the sink with both hands. Her black gown hung open over a simple dress, and the silver bracelet trembled on her left wrist. In the mirror, she saw Olivia, the woman who had learned to sign a borrowed name without crying. But behind her eyes still lived Clara Anderson, Helen's daughter, Henry's daughter, the girl who once believed her father would come if she asked hard enough. A classmate entered, laughing, talking about photos, makeup, and nervous mothers, but stopped when she saw Olivia's paleness. Olivia, are you feeling unwell? She smiled faintly. Just nervous. Her classmate joked that graduation was scarier than the bar exam. Olivia almost replied that she had survived worse trials. Instead, she wet her fingers and touched the scar near her eyebrow. They had told her that new face would be protection, but protection could also become a prison. She had seen Henry in the hallway before hiding. She hadn't expected him to come so early. Part of her wanted to run, pound on his chest, and ask why he hadn't opened the casket, why he let Beatrice speak for everyone, why he cried before a tombstone but never suspected her silence. Another part, smaller and more childish, just wanted to hear his voice saying, "My daughter," no doubt. Her phone vibrated with a message from Robert, sent to the number she had used that morning. "He's here. I won't force a meeting. You decide." Clara closed her eyes. Robert had been the most improbable bridge in her life, the only one who had recognized Helen's old precautions in her fragmented account. He hadn't saved her from the accident, but he had helped her transform fear into proof. Even so, she didn't fully trust anyone who had breathed the air of the Anderson family. She typed simply, "Today he watches, tomorrow he listens." The ceremony began with long speeches, applause, and that collective pride that made parents lean forward with each name called. Henry sat in the back, not in the front row reserved for special guests. Robert sat beside him, attentive to movements in the auditorium and messages arriving on his phone. When the coordinator announced the law class, Henry lost color. The graduates entered in a line, and Olivia appeared among them, walking with the overly firm posture of someone who learned not to collapse in public. She didn't look back. Henry recognized the way she pressed her thumb against her bracelet when she was nervous. It was Clara's gesture since childhood, when she held a broken toy pretending not to care. "It's her," he murmured. Robert didn't dispute it. This time, he'd seen it too, but instead of joy, he felt alarm. Across the auditorium, a man in a gray suit watched Henry, his phone pressed to his ear. Robert leaned in and whispered, "Someone tipped them off that you arrived." Beatrice received the call in the back seat of her car, en route to Sterling Group's office. "He's inside the auditorium," the man said. "And the girl is really at the ceremony?" She closed her eyes, not from surprise, but from calculation. "Take pictures, do not approach." The man asked if he should call the local press, and Beatrice replied, "Not yet. First, we need to turn this girl into a threat, not a victim." Back at the office, she found Mark seated opposite her because he had insisted on accompanying her without warning. "Turn who into a threat?" he asked. Beatrice smiled as if speaking to a slow child, a con artist. "Your stepfather is likely vulnerable." Mark pulled out his phone and opened an old spreadsheet he had found in the holding's financial archives. There was a transfer made 2 years earlier to a medical consulting firm in Indiana, with no contract attached. Authorized by Beatrice, and that was also to protect Henry? She looked at the screen for only a second, but it was enough. Mark saw recognition. Beatrice said, "You don't understand how powerful families survive." He replied softly, "I'm starting to understand how they rot." When Olivia Reed's name was called, the auditorium erupted in common applause, the kind that belongs to everyone and no one. Henry rose without realizing it. Olivia crossed the stage, received her symbolic diploma, and greeted the professor. For an instant, her face turned toward the back. Her eyes met his. There was no smile, no tears, no dramatic rush. There was something worse. Controlled recognition. Clara saw him. She knew he had seen her and chose to keep walking. Henry sat down slowly, crushed by that choice. Robert noticed his pain but didn't try to console him. "She's alive," Henry said, as if confessing a sin. "And she didn't come to me," Robert replied, "perhaps because, for her, you were also dead for 2 years." The phrase hurt, but Henry didn't defend himself. It was a just pain. For the first time, he didn't want an explanation that would absolve him. He wanted the truth, even if it condemned him. After the ceremony, Henry tried to reach her in the hallway, but the movement of graduates, families, and photographers made everything chaotic. He saw her gown, the shining bracelet, her hair simply tied back. He called Clara once, too softly, then louder. Some people looked. Olivia paused for half a second but didn't turn. An elderly man, her professor, approached and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. Henry understood the gesture and stood still. He, who bought buildings, hotels, and corporate consciences with a signature, had no right to cross those few feet without permission. Robert reached him with a grave expression. "We need to leave. The man in the gray suit is filming us." Henry didn't take his eyes off Olivia. "I won't run," Robert replied. "It's not running, it's strategy. If Beatrice turns this into a scandal before we have proof, Clara could be publicly destroyed." The name Clara, spoken by Robert, made Henry accept the retreat. That night, Henry stayed in a discreet hotel in Greenwich Village, far from the addresses where the Andersons were usually recognized. He didn't want dinner. He didn't want to talk to Beatrice, although his phone showed 17 missed calls. Robert returned with preliminary documents and a grim expression. "I found something." Henry raised his eyes. Robert opened a digital copy of a hospital record, legally obtained through an old request by Helen, who had left preventative authorizations in case of succession conflict. On the night of the accident, 2 unidentified young women were admitted. One was registered as a critical patient with burns and facial trauma, the other with trauma but stable vital signs. Henry stood up. Clara was the one Robert pointed to a line, For the first 48 hours, the stable patient appears nameless. Then, she becomes Olivia Reed. Henry felt the room spin, and the critical patient, Robert, paused. Later becomes Clara Anderson. The silence that followed didn't seem empty. It seemed full of an unknown dead woman, waiting to be called by name. Back in Boston, Beatrice entered Helen's old study alone, a room Henry kept closed out of respect or guilt. She knew that place better than she admitted. Behind a shelf of law books, there was a small, old safe she had never been able to open. For years, she had tried to find the combination, suspecting Helen had kept documents there capable of threatening her position. Now, with Clara reappearing, the safe seemed to breathe against her. Beatrice ran her fingers over the lock and whispered, "You always thought you were smarter." But Helen, dead for years, still confronted her through papers, clauses, and a daughter who refused to stay buried. Beatrice's phone vibrated with a message from Dr. Allen. Access to mirror file. Helen Anderson's name appears on authorization. Beatrice clenched her hand until her nails dug into her skin. Then she replied, "Find out who opened it, and if it's Robert Davies, destroy his credibility before he speaks." At the hotel, Henry finally answered a call from Beatrice, putting it on speakerphone. With Robert silently beside him, her voice came through sweet, almost broken. "Henry, please, come home. The press has already started receiving rumors. They're saying you've been fooled by a student." He looked at the documents on the table. "Who told the press that?" Beatrice hesitated. "I don't know, but it's exactly what I feared." Henry closed his eyes. "I saw Clara today." On the other end, her breathing changed. "You saw a girl who looks like her." He said, "She wore the bracelet." Beatrice replied too quickly, "Bracelets can be copied." Henry moved closer to the phone, as if he could confront her through the line. "But guilt cannot, and you're speaking like someone guilty." Beatrice was silent. When she spoke again, her voice was cold. "Be careful, Henry. Pain makes a rich man look weak, and weak people lose everything." He hung up without responding. Robert looked at him. Henry, pale, said only, "Now I know. My daughter didn't call me to a graduation. She called me to a war." Henry didn't sleep. He spent the night sitting by the hotel window, gazing at the dark ocean off Greenwich Village, as if the water could return the 2 years that had been stolen from him. On the table, the documents gathered by Robert formed a pile too small to explain such a grand tragedy, yet heavy enough to crush everything he had believed. Clara was alive. Or at least, the girl buried as Clara, perhaps, had never been Clara. This distinction seemed technical to a lawyer, but to a father, it was a sentence. At dawn, Robert received a short message from Olivia. "Street Teresa's church. He comes alone. You wait outside." Henry read the screen and felt a childish, shameful fear. It wasn't fear of finding an imposter. It was fear of finding his daughter and discovering she no longer needed him. Robert noticed and said, "Don't try to explain first. Listen." Henry replied without arrogance, almost voicelessly, "I spent my life giving orders. Perhaps that's why I've lost the right to ask for anything." The small church in a Brooklyn neighborhood didn't have the gleam of the chapels frequented by Boston's elite. Its pale walls were marked by time, the wooden pews creaked, and stained glass light fell in soft patches on the floor. Henry entered without security, without a driver, without the Anderson name as a shield. He saw her in the third pew, her back to him, wearing a white blouse and dark pants, her hair simply tied back. The silver bracelet rested on her left wrist. For an instant, he saw Clara at 15, annoyed because he had bought an expensive gift instead of showing up for her birthday. Then he saw the woman before him, thinner, harder, with a scar near her eyebrow, and a calm that didn't belong to the daughter he remembered. She didn't stand as he approached, only said, "Looking at the altar, you arrived on time. That must have been difficult." Henry stopped behind the pew. "Clara." She turned her face slowly. "Don't use that name as if you never allowed them to bury it." The sentence cut through Henry without mercy. He sat in the pew beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, as if a wrong move might make her vanish. "I didn't know," he said. She smiled without joy. "That was always your favorite defense. You didn't know I cried when Beatrice said I was just like my mother? You didn't know Mark called me a useless heiress in the company hallways? You didn't know I'd been accepted to a New York university because you never read the letter? You didn't know I called that night?" Henry closed his eyes. "You called?" Clara let out a shaky breath. "3 times. Before the accident. I wanted to come home. I wanted to apologize for our fight. Your secretary said you were in a meeting and couldn't be interrupted." He put a hand to his chest, as if searching for air. That night, Beatrice had entered the boardroom with a pale face and announced the accident. He had never asked about missed calls, never wanted to know what had happened before the end. Clara looked at him and completed, "I died to you before I crashed the car." Henry bowed his head, humbled by a truth he couldn't dispute. "I failed you." Clara laughed softly, but her eyes filled with tears. "Failing is forgetting an appointment. What you did was hand my life over to people who wanted my absence." He tried to approach, but she raised her hand. "No." The gesture was small, firm, and he obeyed. Clara continued, now looking at her own hands. "I woke up not knowing my name. I didn't remember the whole accident. I remembered the smell of gasoline, glass, a woman screaming. Then I remember a white room and a nurse telling me I needed to stay quiet if I wanted to live. My face was bruised. My head hurt so much that even thinking felt like a crime. When I asked for my father, they said I had no family. They said my name was Olivia Reed." Henry gripped the pew tightly. "Who said that?" Clara stared at the altar. People who received orders. People who were scared. People paid to turn a person into a file. Outside the church, Robert waited near the gate, attentive to cars passing too slowly. He received an envelope from a gray-haired woman, simply uniformed, with nervous hands. She didn't want to enter. Her name was Teresa, a former nursing assistant at St. Constance Hospital. Robert had met her 2 months earlier. When Clara finally decided to stop running and start proving she existed, Teresa had kept partial copies of medical records because she feared being accused one day. "I didn't kill anyone," she whispered, "but I kept quiet." Robert replied, "Silence leaves marks too. There's still time to choose another side." Inside the envelope was a copy of the shift schedule from the night of the accident, a handwritten note about 2 unidentified female patients, and a name written in the corner, almost faded, Anna Palmer. Robert felt the weight of that name. It wasn't just about Clara. There was another young woman buried in a lie, one who hadn't even received a last name. In the church, Clara recounted the little she knew. An unknown woman had been taken to the hospital the same night, in critical condition. For 2 days, the hallways filled with security guards, doctors who spoke in hushed tones when she woke. Then, suddenly, her room changed. Her name changed, and a social worker appeared with provisional documents. They said I was a victim of violence, that I needed protection, that my past could put me at risk. I was confused. "I believed anyone who spoke calmly," Henry asked. "And when you recovered your memory," Clara squeezed her bracelet in pieces. "First I remembered my mother, then a song she used to sing, then your office, and then I remembered the fight. I remembered Beatrice on the stairs, saying I would never let Mark be treated as an intruder in his own home." Henry raised his face. "Beatrice said that?" Clara stared at him. "Do you think I'd invent it?" He responded quickly. "No, but the haste didn't erase the wound." Clara looked away. "Before, you would have asked what I did to provoke her." Henry's phone vibrated several times, messages from Beatrice, from Mark, from press advisors. He ignored them until Robert discreetly entered the church, without breaking their agreement, and handed the tablet to Clara, not Henry. She read the headline starting to circulate on corporate gossip sites. "Billionaire Henry Anderson target of alleged con artist posing as dead daughter." Below was a photo of her on the graduation stage, cruelly enlarged, with the scar visible and her face caught at an unfavorable angle. Clara stood motionless. Henry rose in a fury. "Beatrice," Robert said, "there's no signature yet, but the leak came from someone with access to your schedule and travel." Clara handed back the tablet. "She's trying to kill me again. This time without a hospital." Henry turned to her, desperate. "I'll deny it right now." Clara shook her head. "With what? With emotion? With guilt? She'll say you're distraught. She'll use your belated love as evidence against me." Henry was speechless. For the first time, Clara seemed more prepared than he. Not because she was cold, but because she had already bled this war in silence. Robert opened the envelope and showed the documents. "We have leads, but we still need to tie things up. The woman registered as Clara may have been Anna Palmer, a patient with no family located that night. If we confirm this, Clara's death certificate loses its foundation. But we need to be careful." Henry read the name Anna Palmer and felt a new horror. He had cried at a tomb that perhaps held another's daughter, or no one's. Clara closed her eyes. "I think about her every day." Henry looked at his daughter. "You knew?" She replied, "No, at first. When I found out, I thought about coming to you, but then I saw the tribute Beatrice organized for me on the first anniversary of the death. She was crying on television. You were holding her hand, and I understood that my return wouldn't be news. It would be a threat." In Boston, Beatrice gathered lawyers, advisors, and 2 long-standing members of the Sterling Group's board. in a glass-walled room overlooking the city. She wore an impeccable dark blue dress and spoke with the serenity of someone who transformed poison into a report. Henry is emotionally compromised. A young woman appeared in New York, using Clara's personal symbols. The priority is to protect the company, my stepdaughter's memory, and the stability of our shareholders. A board member asked if there was a real chance it was Clara. Beatrice allowed a calculated silence before replying, "Clara is dead. Anyone who questions that questions medical reports, legal documents, and years of family history." Mark, sitting in the corner, watched his mother with growing nausea. He had received confirmation from an internal analyst that the transfer to the medical consulting firm in Indiana was followed by smaller payments to a Street Constance employee. When Beatrice asked for authorization to issue a harsh statement against the imposter, Mark interrupted. "And what if the statement becomes proof of defamation?" Beatrice gave him an icy glare. "Since when do you defend strangers?" Mark replied. "Since my mother started being afraid of a dead woman." The meeting ended with tension. Beatrice pulled Mark into a smaller room and closed the door. "You're forgetting who put you here." He took a deep breath. For years, that phrase had made him obey. She had raised him to believe the world would always try to push him out, that the Andersons would never accept him unless he seized his space before they took it from him. But now he saw the prison within her ambition. "Why did you put me here, Mom? To run a company, or to occupy the place of a girl buried alive?" Beatrice slapped him. It wasn't strong physically, but for what it revealed. Mark put a hand to his face and stared at her, stunned. Beatrice seemed to regret it for half a second, then hardened. "I did everything so you would never be humiliated." He replied softly, "Then why do I feel dirty?" She opened her mouth but found no ready phrase. Mark left, and Beatrice, alone, shattered a glass against the wall. Meanwhile, Clara agreed to meet Henry again in Robert's simple office. Far from the church and cameras, the place had boxes of case files, bitter coffee, and a window overlooking a narrow street. Nothing there resembled the Andersons' life, and Henry realized that Clara breathed better in that space than in any mansion he owned. She placed a folder on the table containing copies of documents, photos of her recovery, and memory notes made over the months. "I didn't call you to save me," she said. "I called to see if you were still capable of choosing the truth when it harms your name." Henry looked at her like someone receiving a deserved sentence. "I choose you." Clara didn't soften. "Don't choose the truth. I was already chosen too late." Robert intervened carefully. "Tomorrow, Beatrice is expected to formalize the accusation of fraud. If that happens, we'll need to respond with evidence, not emotional recognition." Henry nodded. "Then use everything I have," Clara retorted. "Your money doesn't buy my identity." He lowered his head. "I know, but perhaps it can pay for the investigation I should have demanded 2 years ago." The conversation was interrupted by a call from Teresa to Robert. The former employee was crying on the other end, saying a man had gone to her house, threatening her son, and that she wouldn't testify. Clara went pale. Henry reached for his phone, but Robert signaled him not to explode. "Teresa, listen," the lawyer said. "Don't go anywhere. I'll activate legal protection and file the threat." Clara stood up, consumed by guilt. "I dragged her into this." Henry replied, "No, whoever threatens a witness is responsible for the threat." She turned to him, her eyes burning. "You speak nicely now. 2 years ago, you would have had it handled discreetly." He accepted the jab. "Perhaps. And that's why you have no obligation to trust me." The silence that followed wasn't reconciliation, but for the first time, Clara didn't look away. There was a minimal crack in the wall. Not forgiveness. Possibility. That night, Beatrice's official statement was published. Sterling Group declared itself concerned with the exploitation of Clara Anderson's memory by malicious third parties and promised legal measures against any attempt at fraud. News channels repeated the phrase, commentators speculated, and Clara's graduation photo circulated with cruel captions. Within hours, Olivia Reed became a target. Classmates sent confused messages. Professors urged caution. A neighbor knocked on her door, asking if she needed help, or if it was true she had scammed a billionaire. Clara turned off her phone, sat on the floor of her small apartment, and hugged her knees. Henry, in his hotel room, saw the coverage and hated himself for not being able to undo the damage immediately. Robert arrived with the last news of the night. Anna Palmer's original record had been partially located in a municipal archive. The woman had existed, was 23 years old. She had disappeared from the system the same night Clara died on paper. Clara went to the hotel before midnight. Against Robert's advice, Henry opened the door and found her in the hallway, without makeup, with a tired face and a wounded dignity that reminded him of Helen. She entered without asking permission. "I want to know one thing," she said. "If tomorrow it's proven that another woman was buried with my name, will you fight for her too, or just for me, because I'm your daughter?" Henry felt the question pierce him, the true core of that story. He could have responded quickly, promised justice, used grand words, but he chose the honesty of, "Years passed. Perhaps I would only fight for you. Today, if I do that, I remain the man who allowed this lie." Clara breathed slowly. He continued, "I will find out who she was, and I will carry that name along with yours." For the first time, Clara's eyes trembled, not from anger, but from shared pain. She walked to the door before tears could fall. Without turning, she said, "Then tomorrow, stop saying your daughter came back. Say that 2 daughters were stolen from someone." And she left, leaving Henry before the greatest shame and the first decent choice of his life. The next morning, Clara woke before the sun, not because she had slept well, but because fear had driven her from bed. Her small apartment in Brooklyn was silent, with boxes of law books leaning against the wall, and her graduation gown still draped over a chair, a cruel reminder that the happiest day of her life had turned into the beginning of a public war. She washed her face, tied back her hair, and put the silver bracelet on her wrist with the same solemnity with which one dons armor. Robert arrived at 7, with coffee, documents, and deep circles under his eyes. "Beatrice's statement worked," he said, without mincing words. "There are journalists at the university door, at your building, and at Henry's hotel." Clara gripped the folder of evidence with both hands. "Then, let's stop running." Robert stared at her. "Clara, we can still request a private hearing, try for a restraining order, buy time." She shook her head. "That's how they won before, in closed rooms, with papers no one saw. Today, if I have to be judged, it will be before enough people so no one can erase my voice." Henry arrived at Robert's office shortly after, without a tie, with the face of someone who had spent an entire night talking to ghosts. He didn't try to hug Clara. He had learned. Too late that love didn't give him an automatic right to his daughter's wounded body. He placed a thicker folder than Robert's on the table. "I've authorized access to everything under my purview, holding records, payments, proxies, board meeting minutes. I also requested the immediate suspension of any statement issued in the name of Sterling Group without my signature." Robert leafed through the papers and raised his eyebrows. "This will infuriate Beatrice," Henry replied. "She's been infuriated since Clara took a breath." Clara watched her father in silence. There was still in him the man who arrived late, who let secretaries filter calls, who believed in reports because reports were more comfortable than difficult daughters. But there was something different. He wasn't trying to control the truth as an owner. He was offering his own weapons for her to decide how to use them. "I don't want you to speak for me," Clara said. Henry nodded. "Then I'll speak when it's my fault." Beatrice's plan was simple and violent. She had scheduled an emergency press conference in a midtown Manhattan hotel ballroom, using the argument of protecting Clara Anderson's memory and the company's stability. She invited financial journalists, society columnists, and influencers who thrived on elite family scandals. She intended to display death certificates, funeral photos, and an emotionally manipulated timeline to present Olivia Reed as an opportunist. What Beatrice didn't know was that Mark, after a night spent scouring internal archives, had sent Robert proof of transfers, messages from accountants, and an authorization signed by her for payments to intermediaries linked to Street Constance Hospital, along with a note that simply read, "I'm not doing this out of hatred for my mother. I'm doing it because I don't want to inherit a lie." When Clara read the message, she was quiet for a long time. Mark had never been her friend. He had often been cruel, but in that gesture, there was a choice that didn't erase the past, though it prevented it from continuing to grow like poison. At 11 a.m., Beatrice entered the hotel ballroom as if stepping onto the stage of a play rehearsed for years. She wore white, a color carefully chosen to convey pure grief, innocence, wounded motherhood. Beside her were 2 family lawyers and a press officer. Behind them, on a large screen, appeared a photo of Clara before the accident, smiling beside Henry. Beatrice began with a choked voice, speaking of pain, memory, and respect. 2 years ago, our family brutally lost Clara. Now, a woman using the name Olivia Reed is attempting to approach my husband at a moment of fragility. We will not allow the image of our girl to be exploited. Some journalists took notes. Others were already broadcasting live. Then, at the back of the ballroom, a door opened. Clara entered first, wearing simple dark clothes, No jewelry, except for the bracelet. Robert walked beside her, carrying a folder. Henry entered behind her. The murmur was immediate. Beatrice paused for half a second but smiled. "Henry, you shouldn't have come." Henry didn't answer. Clara walked to the front. Stopping a few feet from the table where Beatrice sat, flashes began to erupt. A journalist shouted, "Are you Olivia Reed or Clara Anderson?" Clara turned to the cameras, her voice firm despite her hand gripping the folder. "For 2 years, I was forced to live as Olivia Reed because powerful people decided that Clara Anderson was more useful dead." The ballroom erupted in questions. Beatrice slammed her hand on the table. "This is a monstrous lie." Clara looked at her for the first time. Monstrous was using a sealed coffin to bury a truth you couldn't control. One of Beatrice's lawyers rose, demanding that security remove Clara, but Henry stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. No one touches her. The authority in his voice, the same one that for years moved boards and banks, now protected not a company but a woman he had failed to protect when she was a girl. Clara noticed. She didn't thank him, but she noticed. Robert connected his tablet to the auditorium system before Beatrice's aide could stop him. The documents to be displayed now were obtained through legal authorizations, financial records from Sterling Group itself, and copies preserved by a hospital employee. Any contestation can be made in court. On the screen appeared the first timeline, night of the accident. Admission of 2 unidentified young women, name change. After 48 hours, death registered under Clara Anderson's name. Secret discharge of a patient named Olivia Reed weeks later. Beatrice laughed, but there was a broken metallic sound to it. Loose papers, fabricated evidence. Clara raised her wrist. This bracelet was registered in the hospital's inventory as an item removed from the patient without stable identification. Then it disappeared from the medical record. "It was a gift from my father when I turned 15. Beatrice told him it burned in the accident. Henry looked at the journalists. "I confirm. This bracelet belonged to Clara, and I never authorized its removal, nor did I receive an explanation for it." The second piece of evidence hit deeper. Robert displayed Teresa, the former nursing assistant's, recording, made with legal counsel, the night before. After the threat had been reported, the woman's voice trembled, but her words were clear. She stated that an administrative order had mandated transferring the critical patient's identity to Henry Anderson's daughter, while the stable patient would be kept under another name until further family guidance. She didn't accuse specific doctors beyond what she saw, didn't invent heroism, didn't absolve herself. She simply said, "I kept quiet because I was scared." But the girl who woke up asking for her father wasn't Olivia. She was calling for Henry. The ballroom fell silent. Henry put a hand to his mouth. Clara looked at the floor because hearing her own lost voice through someone else's memory was almost unbearable. Beatrice rose, now without a smile. "This woman was paid," Robert replied. "The threat against her was filed yesterday, and the payments, Mrs. Anderson, point in another direction." Then, Mark entered. He hadn't been announced. He wore the same suit from the board meeting but looked years older. Beatrice turned to him with genuine horror. "Mark, don't do this." He stopped beside Clara, not trying to appear as an intimate ally. "I spent my life believing I needed to seize a place before someone kicked me out of it. My mother fed that fear until it turned into ambition." Beatrice whispered, "I did everything for you." Mark closed his eyes, wounded. "No, you did it for yourself, using my name as an excuse." Robert displayed the proofs sent by Mark. Transfers to a medical consulting firm without a contract, fragmented payments to intermediaries, and internal messages requesting discretion regarding the original heiress. A journalist asked if original heiress referred to Clara. Mark replied before the cameras, "Yes, that's how my mother referred to her when she thought no one was saving the messages." Beatrice took a step back, as if her own son had pulled the ground from under her. But Clara had yet to show the evidence that would truly shift the power. Robert opened the last file, a copy of a clause left by Helen Anderson before her death, regarding asset disposition. Part of Helen's shares would pass exclusively to Clara upon turning 21, and no administrator could transfer, block, or redistribute these assets without direct confirmation of death by independent technical identification. Since the recognition used for the death certificate was administrative, without Henry's presence, without conclusive testing, and under an altered hospital identity, the subsequent transfer of power to the structure controlled by Beatrice could be challenged. The ballroom, which had sought scandal, now witnessed the fall of an empire. Henry took the microphone, but looked at Clara before speaking. She didn't nod with tenderness. She simply didn't stop him. He said, For years, I accepted documents because it was easier to believe in my daughter's death than to face my responsibility. Today, before everyone, I declare that I recognize this woman as Clara Anderson, Helen Anderson's daughter and my daughter. And I also recognize that another woman, possibly Anna Palmer, was buried under her name. My family owes answers to both. Beatrice advanced towards Henry, forgetting cameras, lawyers, and journalists. You're going to destroy everything for a girl who hates you. The question revealed the rotten core of her logic. Clara replied before him, "No, Beatrice. He's going to destroy the lie that kept you standing." Beatrice turned to her, eyes moist but without humility. "You don't know what it's like to enter a family that looks at you like an intruder. You don't know what it's like to hear that your son will never be blood, never an heir, never enough." Clara took a deep breath. For the first time, she saw the wound behind the cruelty. She didn't forgive, but she understood. "Perhaps I don't know what it was like for you, but I know what you did to me." Beatrice was silent. Mark wept silently, ashamed of loving his mother and hating what she had allowed herself to become. Henry asked independent lawyers to forward everything to the competent authorities and announced his temporary stepping down from the board presidency until the investigation was concluded. It wasn't a beautiful gesture, it was necessary, and therefore more valuable. The press conference ended in chaos. Reporters shouted. Lawyers tried to contain damages. Beatrice's press officer had disappeared, his face white. Clara exited through a side door, accompanied by Robert, while Henry remained to answer the first difficult questions. A journalist asked why he had never demanded to see the body. He could have blamed sedatives, shock, manipulation. Instead, he said, "Because I was a coward in the face of pain." The phrase spread through broadcasts before the end of the day. In the hotel hallway, Clara heard the answer on a reporter's phone and paused for an instant. Robert asked if she was okay. She didn't answer. But for the first time, the truth was not alone. Across the hallway, Mark caught up to her. Clara tensed. He kept his distance. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she replied. "Good, because today, I can't," he accepted. "I just wanted to say I will formally hand over everything, including what implicates me." Clara watched him. "Do it for Anna Palmer, too." Mark nodded. "It's the least I can do," she said. "The least came late, but it's still better than nothing." That night, Clara returned to the university auditorium, empty after the graduation. Robert stayed outside, handling calls, and Henry followed her, unsure if he was welcome. The chairs were askew. There were forgotten remnants of flowers and a silence that seemed to belong to another world. Clara walked to the front row and touched the back of an empty chair. "I saved this seat yesterday," she said. Henry stopped behind her. "For me?" She nodded without looking. "Not because I was sure you deserved it, because I needed to know if you would come when no one could send a secretary to say you were." He simply said, "I'll spend the rest of my life arriving early, even when you don't want to see me." Clara closed her eyes. It didn't heal the past, but it didn't sound like an empty promise. It sounded like an accepted debt. She took the bracelet from her wrist and placed it in his palm for a few seconds. Henry almost collapsed. Then she took it back. "It's still mine," she said. He smiled, crying, "I know." And in that empty auditorium, after a truth forcefully extracted, father and daughter stood side by side without touching, separated by 2 years of false death, but united by the first silence that hid no lie. The morning after the press conference, Clara Anderson's name was on every news portal in the country, but she woke in the same small apartment, with the same jammed window, the same weak coffee, and the same feeling that surviving didn't mean being whole. Outside, journalists tried to photograph the woman who, to them, had returned from the dead. To Clara, that sounded absurd. She hadn't returned. She had remained alive the entire time, breathing under another name while the world accepted her absence as fact. Robert arrived early with legal updates, interview requests, and a list of protective measures. "You don't need to speak to anyone today," he said. Clara looked at the gown folded over the chair. "I spent 2 years wanting someone to listen to me. Now that everyone wants to, I don't know if I have a voice." Robert didn't reply with easy comfort. He simply placed an enlarged copy of Anna Palmer's record on the table. "So, perhaps today, the voice can begin with her." Henry, in Boston, entered the Anderson estate for the first time as a visitor to his own ruin. Beatrice was no longer there. In the early morning, her lawyers had taken her to an apartment in Beacon Hill, far from cameras and too close to the consequences. The house seemed larger without her presence, but not lighter. In every hallway, Henry saw choices he had made for convenience. Clara's bedroom door kept closed to appear respectful. Helen's study treated like a museum, the dining table where he had feigned harmony, while his daughter became a stranger within her own family. Mark awaited him in the library, with deep circles under his eyes and a folder in his hands. "I've handed everything over to the independent legal department," he said. Henry didn't sit. "Including what implicates you," Mark nodded. "Including that." A difficult silence followed. Henry could have yelled, thrown him out, called him an accomplice. Instead, he asked, "Did you know she was alive?" Mark replied, his eyes red. "No, but I learned not to ask when my mother told me to keep quiet. That's also guilt." The investigation began without the spectacle the public expected, but with the cold weight of real consequences. Street Constance Hospital suspended administrators. Dr. Allen took a leave of absence before being formally questioned, and Clara's death documents began to be reviewed by competent authorities. Beatrice, advised by lawyers, tried to argue that she had acted to protect Henry from an emotional collapse, but the payments, the messages, and the identity alteration shattered each sentence like thin glass. The Sterling Group board accepted Henry's temporary leave and froze decisions related to shares inherited from Helen until legal conclusion. For the first time in years, the Anderson name didn't open doors. It attracted questions. Reporters camped outside the company headquarters. Analysts commented on governance risks. And families who once vied for invitations to Beatrice's dinners now whispered that they had always suspected her. The elite had no moral memory. They had an instinct for survival. Clara refused the offer to return to the mansion. Henry made the invitation only once, carefully, and received a no without lengthy explanations. He accepted, though it hurt him. "Can I at least pay for a safer place?" he asked. Clara crossed her arms. "You still think care comes with a deed?" He lowered his eyes. "Sometimes, I don't know how else to care." His honesty disarmed her a little, but not enough. "Learn," was all she said. Henry learned, starting with the smallest and most difficult gesture for a man accustomed to solving everything with a signature: waiting. He waited downstairs when she didn't want to see him. He waited for replies to short messages. He waited while she decided which documents to hand over, which interviews to refuse, which memories still hurt too much to be shared. It wasn't passivity, it was reparation without an audience. And for Henry, this was harder than facing any corporate board. 3 weeks later, Anna Palmer's name gained a face, not by miracle, nor by a witness appearing out of nowhere, but by a patient investigation cross-referencing shelter records, social services, and unclaimed disappearances. Anna Palmer was 23 years old. She had come from Ohio to New York in search of work, held temporary jobs, and then vanished after a night where she hitched a ride with people she barely knew. There was no mother crying before cameras, no billionaire father offering a reward. There was a younger sister in Richmond, Virginia, Joanna, who for 2 years had been told that missing adults choose to disappear. Clara insisted on being present when Joanna was informed. Henry also asked to go, but Clara initially refused, then changed her mind. "You'll listen, won't you speak first?" He nodded. In the small public office where the meeting took place, Joanna held Anna Palmer's photo and cried without elegance, without filter, without an important last name. Henry cried alongside her, but in silence. For the first time, he understood that his tragedy had only become news because it was rich. The creation of the Anna Palmer Foundation was not announced as marketing. Clara demanded this. Henry wanted to make amends grandly. She forced him to make amends with utility. The foundation would support the identification of unclaimed persons, provide legal assistance to low-income families, and conduct independent audits in cases of severe hospital identity error. "No photos of you handing over the check," Clara said during the meeting with Robert and a technical team. Henry almost smiled. "You sound just like your mother." Clara was quiet for an instant. Helen was still a sensitive bridge between them. "My mother would have opened that safe before all of you." Robert, who had finally managed to unlock Helen's old safe with authorized documents, placed letters, asset clauses, and an old recording on the table. Helen stated that if anything happened to Clara, no one should accept overly hasty decisions from the Anderson family. Henry listened to his first wife's voice and closed his eyes. Helen had foreseen the danger he had ignored, living within him. Mark sought out Clara on a rainy afternoon outside Robert's building. He arrived without a driver, without arrogance, carrying a box of objects removed from the mansion that belonged to her. Books, photos, letters from Helen, and a denim jacket that still smelled of a closed closet. Clara looked at the box without touching it. "Did you come to return things, or to clear your conscience?" Mark took a deep breath. "Both, perhaps." but I can leave if that offends you." She studied his face. There was tiredness, guilt, and a kind of naked fear he had once hidden behind irony. "You were cruel to me," he nodded. "True, because it was easier to call you spoiled than to admit I was envious. You had blood, history, a mother who still protected you, even dead. I had a living mother teaching me that love was war." Clara didn't hug him, nor did she offer redemption. She simply took the box. Handing over evidence was right. "It doesn't erase the rest," Mark replied. "I know." For the first time, she believed he truly knew. Beatrice accepted a partial settlement only months later, when she realized her version wouldn't survive the documents. She didn't confess everything with tears, because she wasn't that kind of woman. She acknowledged improper payments, interference in administrative records, and deliberate omission of information about the surviving patient. She tried to preserve Mark, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of maternal vanity, perhaps because the two had always intertwined within her until they became indistinguishable. She lost her position, access to the Sterling Group's structure, part of the disputed assets, and the social mask she valued most. In a private hearing, she saw Clara across the room and simply said, "I wanted to secure a place for my son." Clara replied without raising her voice, "You stole mine to build his." Beatrice didn't ask for forgiveness. Clara didn't need her words to move forward. Some people don't offer repentance. They merely offer final proof of who they chose to be. Time didn't heal everything, but it reorganized the pain into less suffocating places. Clara completed her legal internship in New York and turned down 3 offers from famous firms that wanted to use her as a symbol. She chose to work with Robert on cases of civil identity, vulnerable inheritance, and families crushed by oversized institutions. Henry slowly returned to public life, not as the invincible businessman he once was, but as a man watched by his own history. He maintained his leave until the main investigation concluded, then returned with reduced powers, an independent board, and commitments he would have once called excessive. Some said he had grown weak. He didn't care. Weakness, he now knew, was signing papers to avoid looking pain in the face. On Fridays, he traveled to New York without alerting the press. Sometimes, Clara accepted dinner. Sometimes, she didn't. When she did, she chose simple places where he had to wait for a table like anyone else. He never complained. Almost a year after her graduation, Clara presented her final project in a small university auditorium. It wasn't a glamorous ceremony. There was no national broadcast or scandal. There were professors, a few friends, Robert leaning near the door, and Joanna Palmer seated discreetly in the middle of the room. Henry arrived 20 minutes early, holding a bouquet of white flowers without luxurious wrapping. He stopped before the first row and asked with his eyes if he could sit. Clara, already at the table, took a deep breath and pointed to the empty chair. He sat. Throughout the presentation, he didn't look at his phone once. When Clara spoke about the right to a name as a minimal form of existence, her voice trembled but didn't break. She said that a society reveals its character by how it treats those who have no one to look for them. Henry bowed his head, struck and proud. In the end, he was the first to stand and applaud, but he didn't make a spectacle. He simply applauded as a father who had finally learned to arrive. After the presentation, Clara walked out into the hallway, carrying books and flowers given by colleagues. Henry waited a few steps away without intruding. She approached slowly. "You came early," she said. He smiled sadly. "I'm practicing." Clara looked at the bouquet in his hands. White flowers. Henry replied, "For you and for Anna Palmer." For the first time, Clara didn't shy away from the shared pain. She took a flower and handed another to Joanna, who wept silently. Robert watched from a distance, understanding that some victories didn't feel like explosions, but like less heavy breaths. Leaving the auditorium, Henry walked beside his daughter. He didn't try to hold her hand, didn't ask to be called Dad. Then, near the staircase, Clara stopped and said softly, "I still don't know how to forgive everything." Henry replied, "I still don't deserve everything." She looked at him, and there were tears in both their eyes. Then she said, "But you can walk with me outside, Dad." The word came out small, wounded, imperfect. Still, it opened a door. Henry walked beside her, not arriving late, as the New York sun touched the street, as if the world, at last, had learned to pronounce the correct names of the living and the dead.